You're here, listening, in the dark, I guess. I'm not sure if I should tell you these stories, but since you're already here, tell me, where are you right now? And what time is it there? Leave it in the comments. I hope you're not alone, because, after this, you might wish you were. It had been said that the night sky bled once every generation, not in myth, not in prophecy, but in memory, carved deep into the bones of those who had lived to witness it. They had called it the crimson eclipse, and when the red light bled through the heavens, something ancient had always awakened beneath the earth. In the forgotten highlands of the old continent beyond the reach of empire or scripture, there had existed a village untouched by time, not marked on maps, not spoken of by traders. Its name had faded long before parchment could preserve it, but it had survived, not through peace, but through offering. The people had worshipped something nameless, not with reverence, but fear, a god not shaped in man's image, but in shadow and smoke. Each generation had remembered the law: when the crimson moon rose, the strongest would be taken, not the weak, not the sick, but those with blood hot from battle, with rage still burning in their veins. Only the vicious were worthy. They had not been offered willingly. They had been seized, dragged from the hunting fields or training rings, bound in chains blackened by fire and rust. Their cries had echoed down the mountain paths, drowned only by drums carved from the skins of previous warriors. A temple had waited above the village, its stones older than the trees, its altar stained with centuries of regret, and on that sacred rock their bodies had been torn apart, not by blade, but by hand, not cleanly, but with hunger. Their flesh had not been buried, their souls had not been mourned. They had been devoured. It had been believed that the blood fed the deity, that the crimson moon in its thirst required violence to rise again. For a time the land had responded. Crops had flourished. Children had been born strong and fast. No beast had entered the village without offering itself to fire. But peace had never lasted, because hunger, once awakened, had never returned to slumber. In the years that followed, the sacrifices had no longer sufficed. Even before the moon turned red, villagers had vanished. Whole families, gone by morning. Livestock found torn apart, entrails arranged in spiral patterns in the dirt. Wells had filled with blood. Air had thickened with the stench of rot. Even in winter, something had changed. The deity had evolved. Or remember, it had not been content with offerings from the altar. It had begun to choose for itself. The people had continued the rituals out of desperation. They had sharpened their spears, strengthened their walls. But none of it had mattered. When the moon rose red, the screams returned, even louder than before. It had been during the fourth eclipse, after 31 seasons of silence, that the warrior Kalen had defied the right. He had not been born of the village. He had arrived during one of the silent years, carrying only ash on his armor, and eyes darker than obsidian. Some had whispered that he had come from a burned kingdom far to the west. Others had believed he had no origin at all, but his strength had been undeniable, and when the villagers had looked upon him, they had seen their salvation or their doom. Kalen had not offered prayers. He had not bowed before the altar, but when the drums had started and the crimson light returned, he had climbed the temple steps, alone. No chains had bound him, no guards had escorted him. He had walked into the sacred darkness, as though drawn by something older than duty. The villagers had waited, all night, until dawn. But Kalen had never returned. When the sun had risen, it had not brought warmth. The temple had been silent, no birds had sung. The stone had been cold to the touch, and no blood had been seen, but a crack had split the altar clean down the middle. The people had whispered that Kalen's blood had mixed with the Old One's power, that a warrior's defiance had awakened a hunger that had slumbered too long, and from that crack, something else had been born. Not a god, not a man, not a beast, something in between, something uncontainable. Soon after, the blood moon had stopped following its rhythm. It had started to rise without warning, weeks apart, sometimes days. The skies had opened to red with no cycle, no pattern, and each time, something had been taken. Never the same, never predictable, but always brutal. The creature had not been seen, but its presence had been felt. Whispers in the fields, shadows where no light could reach, hands brushing shoulders in locked rooms, breath on the back of the neck, and the smell like copper and rotting lilies. No warrior had been able to fight it. No elder had been able to name it. They had only referred to it as heir of the hollow, born not of the sky, nor earth, but from sacrifice corrupted. Years had passed, generations had fallen, the village had decayed, but the temple had remained, waiting, watch, and some said, if one walked the mountain path at night, the drums could still be heard faintly, like a heartbeat under stone. The path to the altar had been erased by time, but the stone beneath had remembered. The footprints of the warriors, dragged screaming by smoke-skinned hands, had been etched into the soil like scars that refused to fade. Moss had covered some, but the pattern had remained, always upward, always toward the mountain's throat. Those who had survived the first crimson storms had built walls from memory and silence. They had told their children nothing. They had spoken of no gods, no rituals, no Kalen, but the wind had carried the stories anyway, and the mountain had continued to listen. Decades later, a stranger had returned. Not a warrior, not even a man grown, a girl, barely older than 16, with salt dried into her skin and bone-deep weariness in her spine. She had called herself Aryan, but the village had not asked for her name. Names had not mattered since the drums had gone quiet. She had been welcomed only because she had arrived during drought. One more mouth to feed meant one more hand to dig, nothing more. She had taken up residence in the southern edge of the ruins, near what had once been the healer's hut. There, she had listened, not to the people who no longer spoke, but to the walls. She had wandered the cliffs, traced her fingers along forgotten carvings, laid her head to the cracked stone, and waited for it to speak. And one evening, when the sky had turned violet and the clouds had begun to stir unnaturally, she had walked to the foot of the mountain. She had not been called. She had not been chosen. She had simply understood. Something had awakened in her blood. Not memory, but resonance, as though her very being had once belonged to that altar and had simply returned to reclaim it. As she climbed, the air had shifted. Not colder, not thinner, but quieter. Sound had bent strangely in that place. Crickets had ceased their song. Branches had refused to creak. Even her own steps had been muffled by something unseen. It had not been fear. It had been reverence. When she reached the summit, the temple had greeted her, not with grandeur, but with stillness. It had not collapsed. It had not crumbled. It had simply waited. The stones had remained blackened from ancient fires. The altar had remained split, and from within that split, heat had still pulsed, barely perceptible, but steady. Aryan had placed her hand upon it, and something beneath had stirred, not in rage, not in welcome, in recognition. The crack had deepened. A sliver of black light had risen between the stone, so dark it had burned the eyes, and beneath her feet, the earth had breathed. The villagers had seen it, not her, never her, but the sky. It had turned red once more, not over time, but in an instant, as though someone had torn through the heavens and spilled the old blood across the stars. The drums had returned, not by hand, but from within the ground, booming, slow, steady, a rhythm that had not been heard in generations. Those still alive had fallen to their knees, not out of prayer, but collapse. They had known what it meant. The silence had not been salvation, it had been patience. The air had grown restless. Its hunger had changed. It no longer sought warriors or victims. It sought echoes, reflections of the ones who had come before, those whose souls had been touched by memory not lived, but inherited. And Aryan had not been the first, just the latest. In the night that followed, she had not descended. Instead, the mountain had begun to change. The stone paths had shifted, cracking like bones under strain. The trees had bent away from the summit, their trunks blackened by unseen heat. Animals had fled in silence, eyes wide with ancestral dread, and from the temple's core, a shape had emerged. It had not walked. It had not flown. It had bled into the world, cloaked in smoke, formed from pieces of broken time. It had taken the shape of something familiar, humanoid, but unfinished, as though sculpted from screams and shadows. Its face had been blank, its voice non-existent, but its presence undeniable. Wherever it passed, light had died, fires had extinguished, torches had turned to ash, even the stars had flickered dimmer. It had not hunted, it had wandered. The villagers had hidden, prayers had returned, offered with cracked voices and bleeding hands. Sacrifices had been prepared. Not warriors this time, but anything, livestock, children, artifacts. Nothing had mattered, because it had not been appeased. Erin's body had never been found. Only her pendant, left on the altar, half melted from heat, not of this world. And when the blood moon faded once more, the creature had vanished, not in retreat, in pause, waiting for the next echo to arrive, waiting for the next memory to awaken, waiting for the next name to return to the stone. Years passed. The village no longer had a name, not because it had been forgotten, but because no one had dared speak it. To name a place was to give it power, and this one already had too much. Children had stopped being born. Fields had grown brittle. The well had dried, not from drought, but from the water refusing to return. No one had laughed in decades. Those who remained had learned to live in waiting, waiting for the sky to stain itself again, waiting for the drums, waiting for the creature here of the hollow to stir. But silence had its own hunger, and soon, even waiting had begun to rot them from within. Far beyond the mountains, in a region untouched by war or curse, an archive had been discovered beneath a collapsed monastery. A scroll, wrapped in black silk, brittle with age, had been found sealed inside a casket of salt. It had spoken not of gods but of a cycle, a loop made not of time, but of memory reborn. It had told the story of Kaelin, and of a being not born, but forged, one made not of flesh or spirit, but of sacrifice rejected. Those who had read it had trembled. Then they had burned the scroll, not out of fear, but in hope that forgetting might break the chain. But nothing truly forgotten ever stays buried. In a neighboring province, stories began to ripple once more, small ones. At first, a hunter gone missing, a dog found flayed with no sign of struggle, a bell that rang by itself at dusk. Then the sky changed, not crimson, but violet, a new hue, unrecorded, and under that sky Talon had walked. He had been no one, a wanderer, a boy with storm-colored eyes, and no past to speak of, found at the base of a crumbled shrine, silent and thin, yet unafraid. The villagers had taken him in, only because he had smiled at the rain. No one had noticed that he never blinked when the wind whispered through the trees, or that his footsteps had never left prints. He had not aged, he had not changed, he had simply waited. On the night the violet sky returned, he had walked north, not guided, not pursued, just moving, drawn to the mountain that no longer appeared on maps, to the temple no longer recognized by time. The path had opened for him, not by magic, but by recognition. Moss had peeled away, stones had shifted back into place, even the air had tasted familiar, because he had been here before, not in this body, but in another. The altar had remained unchanged, still cracked, still pulsing faintly with heat that had never faded, but the creature had been waiting, not in the shadows, not in the sky, but beneath. Talon had stepped forward. The drums had resumed, not as warning, but as invitation. The mountain had begun to hum, and then the stone had opened, not split, not shattered, but opened, like a mouth made from centuries of silence. A black chasm had stretched downward, swallowing the altar. The wind, even sound itself, from within it, the air had risen, but this time, it had not wandered. It had seen him, and it had stopped. The creature's form had changed. It had mirrored him, height, shape, stillness, two figures, facing each other at the mouth of the mountain, both made of memory, both made of loss. The villagers below had fallen again, not in reverence, but in paralysis, eyes weeping blood, tongues bound by unseen hands. They had known the old law. When one bore the echo of sacrifice, the loop would tighten, and Talon had been the echo, not of Kaelin, but of the first warrior ever taken, the one never recorded, the one devoured before the law had even formed. His soul had returned not to fight, but to finish what had never been completed. He had stepped into the black chasm willingly. No resistance, no fear, only recognition. The creature had followed, and for the first time in centuries, the mountain had gone silent. No drums, no heat, no light, only stillness, complete, unyielding. By morning the temple had vanished, not crumbled, not destroyed, vanished. The peak had become flat, as though nothing had ever been built there. No blood spilled, no altar cracked. The villagers had awoken with no memory of the sacrifices, no tale of Calin, no child named Aaron, no boy called Talon. Their minds had been wiped clean. But deep in the forest, where no tree dared grow, a stone had remained, black, smooth, warm to the touch, and if one listened long enough, a drum could be heard, beating slowly, waiting. The stone had remained untouched by time. No moss had grown upon it, no insect had crawled across it, even the wind had veered away from its surface. Yet something beneath it had pulsed, slowly, methodically, like a breath drawn once every century. Those who had found the stone by accident had walked away changed. Some had gone blind, others had wandered into rivers, never resurfacing. A few had fallen into silence, mouths open, unable to remember their own names. All had heard it, not a sound, but a reminder that the cycle was not broken, only sleeping. Far from the stone, across a dry plain where nothing had ever grown, a girl had been born under a moonless sky. Her name had been Velra. Her first cry had been silent. Her eyes had not blinked. For 3 hours after birth, the midwife had whispered that she looked like someone else, but no one could remember who. She had grown fast, too fast. By the age of 5, she had memorized the names of every plant that no longer existed. By 7, she had begun to draw symbols in the dirt, shapes no one had taught her, and when asked where she had learned them, she had simply stared, not in confusion, but in memory. On the night of her 13th year, a red mist had rolled across the plain, not thick, but dense enough to mute the stars. She had walked into it barefoot, arms open, eyes unblinking. The village had searched for her by torchlight, but no trail had been found, only a spiral drawn in ash, near the old well, identical to the marks left by the creature of the mountain long ago. Far beyond that place, the air of the hollow had begun to stir, but this time, it had not risen from beneath the stone. It had moved through mirrors, through reflections, through the images etched into the minds of those who still feared sleep, and its shape had changed. It no longer resembled shadow or smoke. It had become familiar. Sometimes it took the shape of a boy with storm eyes, other times a girl with black hair braided down her spine, sometimes even a reflection of someone watching. It had entered through silence. It had fed not on flesh or fear, but on memory, forgotten things, unspoken regrets, unfinished rituals. Each victim had been taken not with violence, but with recognition. Their final moments had not been screams, but stillness, as if greeted by something they had once loved, but could no longer name. The world had continued. Villages had risen, kingdoms had fallen, languages had changed, but the rhythm had persisted. Blood moons still rose, sometimes visibly, sometimes only in dreams. Temples still appeared in places where maps had failed. Stones still whispered when no one listened. And every so often, a child was born who knew too much, who walked too confidently, who watched the stars not in wonder but in recognition. Those children carried echoes, pieces of something older than war, older than gods. They were not chosen. They were not cursed. They were resonant. And when the time came, when the moon turned red, or violet, or black, they would walk without fear, not toward salvation, not toward destruction, but toward completion. Because the loop had never ended. It had only folded, waiting to open again, waiting to breathe. And now, it breathes through you.
It had been said that every city sounded different during war. Some rang with sirens and screams. Others remained cloaked in an eerie silence, broken only by the wind whispering through ruins. In Calvrin, the sky itself had been turned into ash. The sun no longer warmed the cobbled streets. It only watched faint and dispassionate from behind a curtain of gray. No clocks worked anymore, but she had known the time. It had been remembered not by the ticking of gears or the chiming of bells, but by instinct, by discipline. She had known it by heart, by breath, by blood. At 10:47 p.m., apologies were refused. At 10:46 they were resented. At 10:44 they were despised. But at 10:45 p.m., precisely, not a moment before or after, regret could be acknowledged. It had been the law she followed, carved deep into her mind like a scar. Her name had once been Leora, now it was nothing more than a whisper, lost among rubble and smoke. She had chosen this rule, not out of vanity or superstition, but necessity. In a world where death could arrive unannounced, rules had become religion, and her time, 10:45, had been sacred, not because it meant anything to anyone else, but because it meant everything to her. People had stopped caring about things like timing, structure, or even apologies, but she hadn't. She had cared deeply, more than she should have. It had started with Malric. The ruins of Building H9 still hissed heat from its shattered walls when he approached. His face had been blackened by soot, but his eyes carried that familiar glint of guilt. He had stammered something unimportant now, and offered his apology. At 10:46 p.m., she had felt the fury before she had realized what it was. It had risen inside her chest like a scream trapped in a metal box. He had been late, 1 minute late. The body had never been found, not because it had been well hidden, but because the city itself had devoured it. The roads were littered with limbs, the shelters overflowed with silence. No one questioned another missing man, not here. The second had been Saren, and her mistake had been the opposite. She had come too soon, 10:43 p.m., by Leora's count. The desperation in her eyes had not moved anything in Leora. All she had seen was the violation of sacred order. An apology made in advance was no apology at all. It had been manipulation in disguise, a trick of timing, a false submission. When the next wave of bombings hit Sector 4, Saren's body had been quietly folded into the broken earth, covered by concrete, forgotten by morning. Leora had stood over the rubble and wondered, not for the first time, how many others shared her appreciation for precision. The world was burning, and in that fire she had found clarity. Days had passed, or maybe it had been weeks. Time behaved strangely in the ashes. Watches had become useless. Phones had died. Even the church bell had fallen silent, its tower reduced to twisted beams. But Leora had still known. She had counted the seconds by heart. 10,000 footsteps from dusk until the moment arrived. Every breath measured, every blink calibrated. 10:45 p.m. had not been just a number. It had been her anchor, her sanity, her law. Guilt had not come easily, even in a place flooded by death. People had become numb, but she hadn't. She had remembered everything. The looks, the broken promises, the dismissed boundaries, and when apologies were made outside the frame she had declared holy, they had meant nothing. Worse, they had insulted the sanctity of her rule. That night, as she sat alone in what remained of a stairwell, her breath had fogged the shattered glass in front of her. Her own reflection had stared back, gray eyes sunken, lips tight. She had whispered something under her breath, inaudible even to herself, and then she had paused. Her hand had reached for the wristwatch she no longer wore. The gesture had been muscle memory. She had squinted toward the eastern horizon, where a sliver of moonlight struck a shard of metal like a sundial. It had been 10:44 p.m., and she had just asked herself for forgiveness. The reflection had tilted its head. A shadow had moved, just slightly behind the curve of the glass. No sound had followed, just cold. It had been a cold that came not from the broken windows or the night itself, but from inside her, a sensation like breath freezing in her lungs. She had broken her own law, and the mirror had noticed. A gust of wind had crept through the fractured wall, lifting the thin fabric of her coat like fingers tugging at her shame. She had remained seated, unmoving, watching the mirror as if frozen in confession. The reflection had no right to shift, and yet it had not just once, but again. Its gaze had narrowed. The lips had curved, not into a mirror of her own expression, but into something twisted, unfamiliar. A faint vibration had passed through the ground, either a distant explosion or something deeper, more personal, a warning. She had stood, slowly, bones creaking from cold and tension. The air had thickened. Each breath had been harder to draw. The mirror had remained still, yet alive. It had waited, judged. It had known. Laura's body had moved on instinct, away from the shard, away from the judgment. But her mind had lingered, stuck in that moment of violation. She had broken the law, her law, and now consequence had stirred. The corridor that led back to the makeshift shelter had once been part of a school. Its lockers, rusted and twisted, still bore childish stickers melted by fire. A paper dove had been fused to the ceiling. The irony had not gone unnoticed. She had walked quickly, but without sound, footsteps muffled by ash, eyes darting, though nothing could be seen clearly anymore. Shadows had moved where no light existed. Shapes had formed where memory had failed. She had not looked back. Looking back would have meant acknowledging the reflection, and that was a risk she could not take. The shelter had been quiet, save for the subtle hum of human despair. Bodies had been wrapped in silence, eyes wide open, limbs twitching in half-sleep. Even in unconsciousness, fear had owned them. She had stepped over the curled figure of a child, holding a cracked doll, careful not to wake the mother curled beside her. No one had spoken. Words had become currency no one could afford. In the farthest corner, behind a curtain made of scorched uniforms, she had knelt and exhaled. Not a prayer, not relief, just a purge of breath, an attempt to reset time. But time had not been so easily persuaded, and the echo of 1044 had stayed in her lungs. It had poisoned her rhythm. It had tainted the ritual. She had betrayed the one precision that held her soul together. Sleep had not come. The eyes of the mirror had hovered behind her lids, even when closed. The memory of that expression had bled into every creak of the pipes, every shuffle of limbs across the floor. She had waited for morning as if it could offer absolution, but morning had only brought smoke. No sun, just the thin glow of dying embers across rooftops. By midday, another name had surfaced, not whispered, not spoken aloud, but felt. Rivan. A figure from earlier days, someone who had once promised loyalty, then vanished at the first sign of struggle, someone who had failed to apologize at all, not early, not late, just never. A different crime, a greater one. She had never forgiven that silence. So when Rivan's name had appeared scrawled in charcoal on a wall near the food ration station, her breath had caught. He had returned, or perhaps never left. She had never confirmed his death. In war, bodies meant closure. Without one, wounds remained open forever. Her heart had skipped, but not from longing, from opportunity. This could be corrected. She had waited near the remains of the watchtower, where the shadows stretched longest before the hour turned. The sun had made its descent behind the gas-scarred buildings, casting the world into bruised purples and blacks. 10:43 p.m. The wind had picked up, a soft rustling through bone-dry trees. 10:44 p.m. No movement. She had exhaled slowly, deliberately. 10:45 p.m. And then, footsteps, measured, hesitant, not rushed, but not confident either. He had arrived.
And in that moment, she had felt a curious warmth behind her. A sensation like being watched not from the front, but from the mirror behind the eyes. Something had joined her. A witness, or a judge. Rivan had not spoken, but his posture had reeked of regret, of rehearsed humility. He had come to apologize, at the correct time, and that had changed everything. She had not felt joy, nor peace, only the sting of a question. What if the timing wasn't everything? What if the ritual had never been about justice, but control? What if she had been the one watched all along? The warmth at her back had turned to cold. She had turned slowly, expecting to see darkness. Instead, she had seen glass, no longer cracked, smooth, waiting. Her reflection had not matched her posture. It had smiled. That smile had not been born of joy. It had not carried warmth, nor familiarity. It had been crafted of glass and cold, of judgment wrapped in calm. The reflection had been no longer bound by her body. It had become its own.
And it had remembered. It had remembered 1044. It had remembered the betrayal. While Rivan stood still beneath the darkening sky, a tension had bloomed between mirror and flesh, between rule and consequence. The air had stiffened, every surface had felt coated in frost. But no frost had been seen. It had been a cold that grew from inside the mind, rooted in guilt, watered by ritual. Laura's pulse had throbbed in her ears like distant gunfire. Time had slowed. The second hand in her chest had ticked louder than the bombs ever had. 10:46 p.m. And Rivan had still been alive. No apology had been spoken, but an expression had been offered. Shoulders dropped, eyes dimmed, chin bowed. It had met the requirements, and yet nothing had stirred in her. No self-affection, no closure, only emptiness. And behind her the mirror had waited. She had felt it, not in vision but in presence, like breath down the neck, like a thought that wasn't hers. The reflection had moved, not a twitch, not a flicker, a full motion stepping forward from the other side of the glass, not through the frame, not through any break in the surface. The glass had not shattered. It had simply been ignored. Reality had not bent. It had yielded. Laura had remained still, not from fear, but from something deeper, recognition. She had known this was coming. A life defined by rigid law had not protected her. It had imprisoned her. Each murder had been painted in the illusion of control, each minute tracked like a heartbeat. But hearts failed, clocks stopped, and mirrors remembered. The figure had stood before her now, identical in every way. Hair, scars, even the slight stoop in the shoulders. But it had not been her. It had been what watched her, always. From the other side, the mouth had remained closed, but the message had been received. She had broken her own code. She had built a world on time and sacrifice, then cracked it with her own breath. She had apologized early, and no one, not even she, had been above the ritual. The glass figure had stepped closer, and Rivan had finally spoken, but only in movement. He had turned his back, not out of indifference, but understanding. Forgiveness had already been offered. He had fulfilled his part. He had walked away, unharmed. It had been a strange kindness in that moment, as if the war outside had paused, just long enough to allow one man to vanish in peace. But Laura had not been granted the same mercy. The reflection had reached forward, not with violence, but with inevitability, like the setting sun, like the ticking clock. The hand had passed through her chest, not physically, not visibly, but it had been felt, a pulling, a draining, like ink being drawn from skin. Memories had unraveled, faces had dissolved, names had scattered like cinders in wind, and all that had remained was the hour, 10:45 p.m. She had fallen, not from force, but from release, and when her eyes had blinked open, she had not been on the ground. She had been standing, inside the glass. The world outside had looked blurred, distant. She had seen herself, or rather the version of her that now walked in her place. It had moved with precision, measured steps, a calm smile. It had taken her coat, her place, her law. It had become her in every way but one. It had not needed rules to feel real. It had needed freedom. She had raised her hands, palms against the inner glass. No one had looked her way. The new Laura had stepped into the smoke-filled streets, with an ease she had never known. It had not checked the time. It had not waited for apologies. It had simply moved forward. Time had passed differently behind the glass. It had not been measured by seconds, nor by the rotation of light and dark. It had been marked by moments forgotten. Laura, the true Laura, had waited, not for escape, not even for rescue. She had waited for understanding, but the mirror offered no clocks, only reflections. She had seen the world move without her. The new version of herself, formed from silence and fury, had walked through ruins like a shadow, granted flesh. Apologies had still been received, but not for forgiveness, for record-keeping. Names had been taken, times remembered, but no lives had been spared. The war had continued, but now it had a witness dressed in skin that once belonged to her. Behind the glass, Laura had felt herself unravel slowly. No hunger, no thirst, only memory. Each face, Malric Seren, Rivon had floated before her, then faded like smoke into mirrors within mirrors. Apologies echoed, but out of order. 1039, 1050, 1028, all of them wrong, and all of them irrelevant now, because the one apology that mattered, her own, had never reached the hour it was meant for. She had started to forget, not just people, but feeling. Rage had become distant. Regret had become soft. Even time had become foreign. A language she once spoke fluently, now reduced to syllables and fragments. She had become an idea trapped in glass, not punished, not destroyed, but preserved. The new Laura, the shadow, had no need for rituals. She had watched it laugh once, openly, while watching fire consume a church where dozens had once taken shelter. There had been no judgment, just interest, an experiment in chaos, carried out by a creature who had once memorized every ticking second. Eventually the war had ended, or perhaps it had shifted, moved elsewhere. The sounds of bombs had given way to the sounds of rebuilding, hammers, voices, the occasional bird, but the reflection had remained, still walking, still watching, still collecting apologies that no longer mattered. And Laura had remained in the glass, unnoticed, until the child came. A girl barely 7, had stumbled through the broken corridors of the old shelter. She had not screamed, she had not run, she had wandered, drawn by something, some Hume behind the wall. She had found the mirror by accident, or fate, and she had looked. Laura had tried to speak. No words had formed, but the child had tilted her head, just slightly, as if she had heard something anyway. Their eyes had met, and the child had smiled, not with cruelty, but with recognition. Then she had turned her wrist. A watch had been revealed, still working, still ticking. The child had tapped the glass once, and walked away. It had been 10:45 p.m. For the first time in years, if years could even be measured, Laura had felt her hands warm. Not heat, but life. Her breath had returned, shaky, real, and in that moment, the mirror had no longer held her. It had reflected her, and beyond the glass, a figure had stood. Laura, reborn, not the shadow, not the machine, herself. No smile, no certainty, just presence. The mirror had clouded, once, then cleared, and she had been standing outside again, ash under her feet, sky above her, weight in her limbs. Time had returned. She had looked at her own reflection in a broken piece of glass on the ground, and she had whispered something, not with words but with being only at 10:45. But this time, it hadn't been a rule, it had been a choice.